Yes, thank you. So today we have our next lecture on network models, and this will be the beginning of the federated learning part of this course. So far, we have mostly reviewed or built the basic foundations of machine learning. And now we will use these basic building blocks to model federated learning applications and study federated learning methods. But before I start with the actual lecture content, just a few comments on the course organization. So I have received your feedback for the survey, how are you? And some of these comments were asking for using slides. So using slides as a main material for lectures. And I will now try, at least for this week, for the 2 lectures in this week, to have slides as the main material for the lectures. So also the quiz questions, they will be based on the contents of the slides. Yes, another bunch of questions was about the lab exercises. So some students would have liked to have more time to play around with Raspberry Pi, so with actual hardware. We will most likely not offer more labs like this, but rather you will have the opportunity in this in the student projects to implement federated learning algorithms in hardware using your Raspberry Pis. So I encourage you, if you're interested, to get more practice with implementing federated learning algorithms using mini computers like the Raspberry Pis we have used in our labs. Use these applications or use this hardware if you have it available in the student projects. We have at least 2 Raspberry Pi computers that we can offer you, but of course, if many of you want to do a project with Raspberry Pis, then it might be a bit difficult to organize or to share these Raspberry Pis, but we will find a way, I'm sure. So I just have added more details about the federated learning project. As I already discussed at the beginning of the course, the project gives you the opportunity to earn 10 credits. So there's this basic variant of the course, which consists mostly of the lectures and the multiple choice quizzes that we had so far and that we continue this week. And this basic variant is worth 5 credits, but you can extend to a 10 credit variant by doing a student project. So the main deliverable of this student project will be a project will be a project report. So I have put here already a template, so you can find a template for the project report that gives the structure. So you have to follow the structure of this report, particularly the sections, section names, and the contents of the sections. So it's pretty much pre-specified, and the grading will be based on peer grading. So the grading for this extended variant will be based on the grade you get from this basic variant of the course. So for example, your quiz questions and the labs. And second component for the grading in this extended variant will be peer grading. So you will grade the reports of others, and you will get graded by your colleagues. So I will, hopefully this week, I will have the draft for the peer review questions ready, and I want you to comment on them. So I will take into account your comment and your concerns, because I understand that peer grading can be stressful, but I want to involve you as much as possible in the design of this peer grading system. So you have the chance to comment on the peer grading questions that you have then to fill out, or that are filled out for your report. Okay, there was one question regarding Lab 1. So Lab 1, I think, is over the schedule, but you can still, if you have the possibility to do the lab yourself, so you have hardware, please send us an email or remind us. If you have already sent us and didn't hear back, remind us by email to our course email address. we will arrange then an individual lab exercise even remotely for you. Yes, there was another question regarding the FITech students, if they can get 10 credits. I still need to ask the FITech coordinators. Yes, still need to do that. We still have a bit of time because the idea of the project would be to have the most workload in end of April, May. So the May should be then devoted to the federated learning project. So we still have a bit of time to fix the last nitty-gritty details of the student project. Okay. Yes. Then I also want to quickly discuss one of the quiz questions that are now finished, and I got some questions how to solve them, or what would be the correct solution. In particular, there was one example, or there was one quiz question for perturbed gradient descent. So if I remember correctly, please correct me if the question was different than what I have remembered. So you had given a convex function. So this f here, f is a convex function of some parameter vectors, for example, w. And we assume it is smooth, so it has, we can compute the gradient. The gradient is well defined for each point, and it is also strongly convex. So this is to make sure that there exists an optimal vector such that f w star is the minimum. So there's a minimizer. And yes, sorry if some of you are now in the lecture hall. I tried to announce it by Slack today. So today I'm in Zoom only, but you can of course follow me in Zoom also in the lecture hall. So the lecture hall is reserved. You can stay there. Sorry for the misunderstanding. Okay, so we have the existence of a minimizer, and the question was, is it possible to find a choice for the step size or for the learning rate? So here we have the learning rate alpha k, which is required to be between 0 and 1, by the way, but otherwise arbitrary. So can we find a choice for the step size such that this iterates, so that wk eventually converges towards the optimum? And the answer is no, because by an proof by contradiction argument, so let's assume there would be such a sequence. So we would find a sequence such that the iterates get closer and closer to the optimal weight vector. So what would that mean for the gradient? So let's assume we have a sequence, or let's assume we have found alpha k step sizes that satisfy this constraint. So they are between 0 and 1, and wk converges to the optimum. So what does that mean for the gradient? How does the gradient behave? What can we say about the sequence of gradients? So for each iterate, we compute the gradient, so we get a sequence of these gradients. What can we say about the gradients? Yes, it must tend to 0, because this must go to the 0 vector, because the gradient at the optimum is the 0 vector for a convex function, and it is, I assumed it's also a smooth function. So the gradient cannot increase arbitrarily if you stay within a certain neighborhood of the optimum. So if we get closer and closer to the optimum, also the gradient must get closer and closer to the 0 gradient for the optimum. Okay, but if we then look at the update at the perturbed gradient descent step, So what we get is minus alpha k, and this gradient here gets smaller and smaller. So this one eventually becomes negligible because alpha k cannot be larger than 1. So we cannot amplify this ever more decreasing gradient, or this gradient that goes towards the 0 vector. We cannot amplify it arbitrarily large because alpha k is required to be between 0 and 1. So this one becomes 0. So what remains then is this perturbation term, ek. So what we get is that for sufficiently large iterations or sufficiently high iteration numbers, this difference between consecutive perturbed gradient descent steps is approximately this perturbation, and we assume that the perturbation has always norm 1. So this means that the norm of this of the difference between consecutive iterates has norm approximately 1, or more and more close to 1. So this means it cannot converge because the norm of consecutive sequence elements, if a sequence converges, must be 0. So it difference between consecutive vectors of a sequence that converges, and in particular would converge to the optimum, would need to have norm 0. But this contradicts the fact, due to the perturbation, that the norm is more and more equal to 1 because of the perturbation. So there cannot exist a sequence of weight vectors that converges to the optimum for any arbitrary choice of step sizes that satisfy this constraint. So they are between 0 and 1. Okay. So the answer was no, it's not possible to find a sequence of step sizes such that the perturbed gradient descent steps converge to the optimum of the function. But there might be certain choices for these perturbations, or certain sequences of perturbation vectors that have norm 1, where the perturbed gradient descent steps or iterates still converge, but not to the optimum. So they might converge to some other point that give a gradient that just counteracts then the perturbation that you add in the gradient descent step. However, it cannot converge to the optimum. So this was the question asked specifically, can this perturbed gradient descent steps converge to the optimum of the function? So it's not asking can they converge at all, but do they converge, and do they converge to the optimum of the function? Okay. So this was a bit more tricky question, I admit. Yeah, so if we constrain the learning rate to be between 0 and 1, then the perturbation must decrease. So the norm of the perturbation must get smaller and smaller. Yes, only then it can converge to the optimum. And yeah, by the way, so what could be a source of this perturbation? Let's discuss this a bit more. What could be the source of the perturbation? Where do we have it? Let's remove this here. So we have here perturbed gradient descent. What can be a potential source of this perturbation? Is it just me as a professor, as a teacher, who wants to make a gradient descent more interesting? So just for fun, I add a perturbation term. Why could this be a useful model in practice? What could this perturbation term represent? Any ideas? Yeah, calculation errors. For example, what I write down here easily and without any effort here, this matrix. So if this is a quadratic function, then it's a matrix vector multiplication. But here it would be vector additions. But these additions, adding these vectors, must be done with finite bit widths. So with finite word lengths in a computer. So you will have numerical errors. So these perturbations can represent the numerical errors that arise because you only use 16 bits, or I don't know, 64 bits if you have a very powerful computer to represent numbers in a multiply and accumulate unit, as they are called in digital signal processors, for example. Okay, what other source could there be for perturbations in the gradient step that we actually intentionally incur? So what variant of gradient descent did we talk about in the lecture about gradient methods? Yes, so we could also say we understand well how gradient descent works for a convex function. So we know well how it works for a convex function. So it would be nice. What could we do? And in practice, you might have non-convex functions, something like this. In practice might be f this. So you could say I approximate my non-convex function by some approximation of a nice smooth convex function, and then you could say the gradient that you compute, or the gradient that you compute of the non-convex function is actually the gradient of the convex function plus some error term. So you can then still use the analysis of gradient descent for convex functions. So this is a pretty neat use of perturbation, of perturbed gradient descent, in order to make your analysis easier of a more difficult function. You just approximate it by a convex function, and you say the gradients that you get from actually what you compute are the gradients of this non-convex function. But you say these are close or approximations to the gradient of the convex function plus some error term. And this discrepancy here, this discrepancy is exactly what you can accommodate in the perturbation here. Okay, and do you have another idea where this perturbation could come from? What other variants of gradient descent did we talk about in the, or did I mention in the gradient methods lecture? So we had plain gradient descent, then we had, yes, so any form of hard or software failures when you have to communicate data points in order to compute the loss functions and gradients. This can give rise to these perturbations. But can you think of a stochastic source of these perturbations? So some form of random experiment that gives rise to a perturbation. So this would then become a random variable. Did we talk about stochastic flavors of gradient descent? Or do you know a stochastic variant of gradient descent? Yeah, yes, stochastic gradient descent, exactly. Stochastic gradient descent, and the idea is instead of computing the gradient, which could be for linear regression, the gradient looks like this. It looks like a sum over all data points in your training set, and the training set might be billions, 10 to the power of 9. So we don't want to compute the sum, but instead, so in this sum, we have something like feature vector of the ith data point, label of the ith data point minus feature transposed weight vector, something like this. So the gradient is a sum of many, many components, and we approximate it by using a subset or a batch of a small number of components and only sum over those. And this here is this I called, I think, a gradient approximation, and this is stochastic, a stochastic gradient approximation. And when you use such a stochastic gradient approximation, you essentially introduce an error term. So stochastic gradient descent is actually an instance of perturbed gradient descent. However, what is different in stochastic gradient descent, you can read this up in the lecture notes in more detail, you scale the perturbation term by the step size. So in stochastic gradient descent, we have control over the magnitude of the perturbation. and it's scaled using the step size itself. So in stochastic gradient descent, we can make the perturbation as small as we want by choosing the step size as small as we want. So the smallest possible step size would be alpha k equals 0. Is this a good choice for the step size in stochastic gradient descent? I mean, we would remove the perturbations. No, but what is the drawback of using this small step size, 0? What is the progress that we do in an iteration? 0, because we don't move at all, no progress. So it's not useful. So we must use step size larger than 0. And typically we use step sizes that scale with the iteration like 1/k. Okay, so that was a little impromptu on gradient methods, gradient descent, and perturbed gradient descent, and stochastic gradient descent. Are there still questions you would like to ask now? Okay, if there pops up more questions later, post them on the chat and I will try to answer them later. But now I then continue with today's lecture, which is on network models. So as I said, now we start talking about federated learning problems and federated learning methods. So federated learning is a special case of machine learning. So what are the 3 main components of machine learning? Yes, data model loss. And how do we combine them? How do we combine data model loss? What do we use to bring these 3 components together? So here we see these 3 components. We have 2 hypothesis maps, which makes a model. We have some data points, which is the data, and we have a measure for the error. Yes, and we bind them together by minimizing the average loss or empirical risk. So empirical risk minimization is the kit that brings everything together, the 3 components together. Okay, so, and just to remind you, the basic workflow is as follows. We train a model, or we learn the best hypothesis on a training set, and then we validate. So this I need to always mention. Never stop after training, always validate. What we do then is we choose between different models based on the validation error. Okay, and to speed up this model selection, I mean, this is the basic idea. This is, I would say, still the basic idea of applied machine learning, trial and error. So this is trial and error. Pick whatever fancy model you come across. Now transformer models are hip, so let's fit the transformer model and apply it to your data. Look at the validation error, and maybe it beats your old linear regression model. So you pick the transformer model. And then maybe next year some other fancy model comes across, you try it out, and if it's better on the validation set, you pick this one. So that's the name of the game in applied machine learning often. But this can be wasteful. So you might waste a lot of computation on trying out models, which could be easily told to be not the best one. And one indicator, if a model works well, is the ratio of its effective dimension and the number of data points in the training set. So if this ratio here is much larger than 1, then you are most likely overfitting the training set. So you should always ensure that D over M is smaller, hopefully much smaller than 1. One way to do this is to make the effective model dimension small. So use smaller models, or use larger data sets. And today I will talk about network models for data, where the idea is to use the network structure to find the right chunks of data to make this M larger. So we will see how we can use the network structure to find the right data points to add to our training set. So we want to use network models to find the right data points to add to our training set. Okay, So networks, I already mentioned networks. Network weather data, for example. What is network weather data? Well, we have in Finland, we have the Finnish Meteorological Institute, and each weather station, so this here is one weather station from the Finnish Meteorological Institute, so this FMI station collects data. For example, daily temperatures, minimum daily temperature and maximum daily temperature. So this would be the picture of machine learning so far. So we have a data set and we want to fit a model. Now, from today on, we look at networks of data sets. So we have local data sets, chunks of data. So I call this a local data set. And we have many of them. Does any one of you know how many FMI weather stations there are in Finland, roughly? Do we have somebody from FMI here, by coincidence? So around, we currently work with this FMI data. So my current overview is around 200. So we have around 200 such stations, or FMI runs 200 such stations that I know. So maybe there are some that are not made public. But we have 200 such local data sets. So we have a separate data set for each weather station. Okay, another example of network data is image databases. For example, ImageNet. You might have heard about ImageNet. It's a big database of images, and this has been used to train neural networks. So these were used to get the first super powerful deep neural networks, or train the first neural networks that made it really into the media, get a big impact. But it was around 10 years ago or so, a bit more than 10 years ago. And one key for the success of these deep learning methods was to have a large data set, but not only have a data set, but also have a structure in this image data set. So we have like an ontology. So we have a relation of different images. We have images of mammals, which include as special cases placental images, which include a special case. I think here, yeah, this is special case relations. So here we would have a chain. So this is what I call a chain. It's one type of network structure, a chain. Okay, then another example of a network structure is monarchy. I guess we all like to watch the royal weddings and so on and so forth. And here the network structure is a tree. Hopefully it's a tree. So we have this ancestor descendants relationships. And for each node here, we have data sets. So what could be a local data set here for Carl Gustav? What do you think? What could we use as data for characterizing this node, Carl Gustav? Last name, age, weight, yes. But nowadays, when you want to find out something about a person, what's the first thing you do? Maybe. Well, we could Google it and look up the Wikipedia entry. So behind this one, there's a Wikipedia entry. We can then look up also the Wikipedia entry of Queen Sylvia and so on and so forth. Yeah, another example, finance networks. Also, you can also break a regular data set or a standard data set into smaller chunks. You could say you have here this single data set, but for some reason you want to partition it according to the feature values. So you want to have different feature ranges or data points with different feature values ranges to belong to a different node in a network. You could get such network structure by clustering. So this could be the result of this could be a soft cluster obtained by a Gaussian mixture model. So you can also break a regular data set into smaller chunks and then define a network structure between these smaller chunks. Okay, yeah, another network that is all around us is a road network. We have a big road network in Finland. Business processes. So this is an important example of networks, which is time series data. So time series data is also an example of a network. And again, we have here So we have time instance, and at each time instance we have some local data set. So all the processes or all the tasks that have to be done at this time step. And here we have all the tasks done at this step, and the tasks or task descriptions could be local data sets. And the network structure again is here a chain. Okay, yeah, related to what I talked about, the noble networks to get data from the internet or Wikipedia, actually the data that is underlying Wikipedia entries is organized as a network structure. It's called Wikidata. Wikidata is a big network database or network structure database where different objects or facts are related by different relations, which are encoded as the links of a network. Okay, so in what follows, we will use the term empirical graph, or we use empirical graphs to represent collections of data sets. So an empirical graph consists of nodes. So here we would have 4 nodes, and each node itself carries a data set. So this node carries a data set, a bunch of data points. This node here carries another bunch of data points. Could also be only one data point. So I do not restrict the size of the local data sets in any way. Yes, and what is nice, what I would like to point out here, this is also related to the student feedback, which asked for more hands-on exercises or illustrations of the theoretical concepts using, for example, Python code. And here I've shown a Python code snippet using the NetworkX library. So the NetworkX library provides very convenient tools to store networked data. And for example, here, these 2 lines of code generate an empirical graph, or it's called a NetworkX object graph, which consists of a certain number of nodes. And we can add, so what is really cool about this NetworkX objects or NetworkX graphs, that we can attach to the nodes basically whatever we want. We can attach to the nodes, for example, NumPy arrays, which hold the feature vectors of local datasets. Okay. Yeah, here I've shown a bit in more detail source code. I will also share some demo notebooks, some Python notebooks with you after this lecture, where you can run this code that is depicted here in these code snippets. Okay, so beside the nodes, an empirical graph also contains edges. And these edges, they are basically defined, or they represent pairs, unordered pairs of nodes. So we have an edge between 2 different nodes, but there's no direction. So the node I1, for example, here, and I2, they have the same role in this link here, in this edge. So they are undirected edges. These edges indicate a notion of similarity. So there's one question: is the clustering of a data set a design choice? Can I use statistical parameters from a specific field of study to cluster my data? Yeah, so this is essentially a design choice. And what we will now mostly use to cluster the data in what follows is these edges. However, these edges, they of course don't fall down the sky. So we shift the design choice from the clustering, which local data sets to connect, to a bit of a simpler design choice, which is to find out which pair of local data sets are more similar or not. So we reduce the burden of design choice from partitioning the local data sets into similar data sets to only finding out for pairs of local data sets if they are similar. So this might be in some applications might be simpler to test if 2 data sets are similar or not. Yeah, by the way, would you know how to measure similarity between 2 data sets? So if I give you 2 data sets, so we have here one data set, and here we have another data set. How would you measure the similarity between those 2 data sets? So here we have data set A, we have data set B. Distance, yeah. How would you measure the distance between 2 data sets, which might have different numbers of data points? average distance. So you could compute the center here, you could compute the center here, and then use the distance between the centers as a, or the inverse of this distance as a measure of similarity. Yes, that's one possible way. Yeah. Okay, there are other tests or similarity measures that are related to statistical tests. And here I have shown a code snippet that computes what is known as a Kolmogorov-Smirnov test. And these tests, what these tests do is related to the idea of computing the center, but computing more than a center. For example, also computing the variation or covariance. So not only comparing the means, the distance of the means, but also comparing if the covariance matrices have similar shape. So that's the basic idea behind most of these tests for statistical similarity. Often there is some domain-specific notion of similarity, like in the weather application, we have a local data set is attached to each weather station. So it might seem reasonable to use the distance, for example, the geodesic distance between weather stations to measure the similarity between local data sets. However, this might be misleading because, for example, maybe some of you know, so if this here is the map of Finland, roughly, here is the sea. So you would have, if you look at, if you use the spatial distance to measure similarity, for example, then here these weather stations in Helsinki might not be similar to the weather stations up here, which might be in Vaasa. However, from a statistical similarity point of view, they might be very much similar because they are along the coastline. And on the coastline, for example, when you look at wind speed data, you might have a higher similarity between those two than, for example, between Helsinki and something in, what is here, Lahti maybe, which is more inside the land. So the important point here is there are different notions of similarity, different measures of similarity, and which you choose in the end is a design choice. So overall, the empirical graph is a design choice, and this design choice has to balance between conflicting goals. So we will see in next week's lectures, when we talk about federated learning algorithms, that the computational complexity of those algorithms typically scales with the number of edges. So for each edge, we have a fixed number of computation. And the more edges, the more we need to compute or to communicate. So from this, we would like to have as few edges as possible. On the other hand, so from this regard, the ideal empirical graph would be the completely unconnected empirical graph. So no edges at all, which is a bit trivial. And this would basically mean that the local data sets are considered completely independently from each other. So we would have a completely separate learning task, for example, for this node here, I=1, and then another learning task for node I=2. So we don't want that. We want to couple them somehow. And how do we couple them? Well, we couple them by the edges. So we want to have a sufficiently large number of edges between nodes for which we expect or suspect that they carry similar data sets or statistically similar data sets. So we want to also have a sufficient number of edges between similar data sets. So this is, again, a trade-off. There's a question, does one draw the edges only between similar data sets? Yes, but as I said, there are different notions of similarity. So there are different ways to construct this empirical graph. One way would be for FMI weather stations. So when each node corresponds to FMI weather station, you could then draw an empirical graph by connecting each FMI weather station to the two nearest neighboring weather stations. Another option would be that you compute not the geographic distance or the geodesic distance between FMI weather stations, but you compute statistical distances between the weather observations at these data sets. And then, but still you can then again use this concept of k nearest neighbor graphs, because you want to still keep the number of edges as small as possible. And one way to do this is to say for each node, you only connect to, at most, for example, to 3 other nodes. But which other nodes is then an important design choice. Yeah, by the way, this some terminology. So when you look at an undirected graph, so this here is one node, for example, then we call this here, these nodes that are connected to this node is called the neighborhood of node 1. And the number of neighbors is called the degree, the node degree. So the degree here would be 3. Okay. Yeah, by the way, does anyone know what is this, for example, this empirical graph, is this the smallest possible graph such that each node is connected with other nodes via some path? So are 3 edges necessary to connect 4 nodes? Yes, because this is a tree. So this is a special case of an empirical graph, which is a tree. So these trees are the most efficient choice of empirical graph when one wants to ensure that each node reaches each other node via links. Okay, yeah, just continuing here, this example, what is the largest possible graph? So what is the graph with the most edges? And how many edges does this graph have? Does anyone know the name of the graph, of a graph that contains the maximum number of edges? Complete graph, yeah. So in the complete graph here would have an edge between every pair of nodes. So this is then known as the complete graph. And there's a nice formula. So the complete graph for n nodes has how many edges? So what's the maximum number of edges that we can place in an empirical graph with n nodes? (2cn). Yes, do you know a formula that only uses n and basic algebra or basic algebraic operations? Where are the graph theorists? So it is n times n minus 1 over 2. That's the maximum number of edges that a graph with n nodes can have. Okay. And this is rather large. So it's basically n to the power of 2. It scales with n to the power of 2, the number of edges in the complete graph. So if you have many local data sets, if you have large networks like the internet with billions of users, each user generating a local data set, then you don't want to use the complete graph because it has too many edges. Okay, then what we will need in the next lectures, in particular, to understand the statistical properties or the behavior of federated learning algorithms, it is useful to look at matrices that are associated with graphs, with empirical graph. In particular, we will use what is called the graph Laplacian matrix. So I have shown here an example, an empirical graph with 3 nodes, 1, 2, 3 nodes, and 2 edges. And the Laplacian matrix, is obtained by putting on the main diagonal. So each entry on the main diagonal corresponds to 1 node. So this entry corresponds to node 1. And in each of these main diagonal entries, we put the sums of all weights of incident edges. So all the edges, we look at all the edges that go into node 1 and sum up all the weights. Yeah, I forgot to mention, for each edge in an empirical graph, we also have an edge weight. And this edge weight, this is non-negative. this measures the amount of similarity. So this allows us to give a more fine-grained control of the similarity structure in the empirical graph. In some applications, it's fine if you use the same edge weight for all edges, for example, equal to 1. This is then what we call a uniform weighted graph. But in other applications, it might be more useful to use different weights for different pairs of nodes. For example, to derive the edge weight from the distance between nodes if they represent, for example, weather stations. So then we can use the distance between the nodes to define the edge weight. Okay, so in this Laplacian matrix, we put on the main diagonal the sum of all attached, the sum of the weights of all attached edges. So for example, for node 2, this here corresponds to node 2, we have A12, the weight for the edge between 1 and 2, and the edge between 2 and 3. So we have now the sum of 2 edge weights. And in the off-diagonal entries, so each off-diagonal entry corresponds to a pair of nodes, and this pair is characterized by the column number, so j equals 3, and by the row index or row number, which is I equal 2 here. So this entry corresponds to the pair of nodes 2 and 3, and the entry is 0 if there is no edge, but if there is an edge between node 2 and 3, which is the case here, then it's minus the edge weight. Okay, so this is this basic recipe how to build up the graph Laplacian matrix. So you might wonder why the heck do we need the graph Laplacian matrix? Why bother with matrices? Because they tell us a lot about the cluster structure. So in the beginning, there was one of you asking how do we choose the cluster structure? Well, if we have an empirical graph, the cluster structure is then can be read out of the graph Laplacian matrix. In particular, the eigenvalues of this graph Laplacian matrix are all real valued and non-negative, since this is a positive semi-definite matrix. And the eigenvectors corresponding to the smallest eigenvalues, they are piecewise constant over clusters in the graph. So you could try out this example yourself with a very specific graph which consists of 2 components. So this graph is an extreme case of an empirical graph that consists of 2 components, and then you will find out when you compute the eigenvalues or the eigenvectors using, for example, a NumPy function that is shown here. Then the eigenvectors, they assign to each node a value, the entry of the eigenvector, and one of these eigenvectors is 1 for all nodes in one cluster and 0 in the others. And then another eigenvector is vice versa. So the entries of this other eigenvector, they are 1 for all the nodes in the other cluster and 0 in the first cluster. So the eigenvectors of the graph Laplacian matrix, they fully determine the cluster structure, the intrinsic cluster structure of the empirical graph. Okay, so far we have only talked about data. So the first component, a machine learning. So what's the second component in machine learning? What is component 2 in machine learning? Model, yes. So we're not only attaching data sets to the nodes of an empirical graph, but we also attach models, and we call them local models. So what is a model again? Does anyone remember what a model is in the context of this course? What is a model? Here's one answer, a function that maps input to output. Is this a model? So is this a model, a function that maps input to output? We call this function typically a hypothesis. Is this what we mean by a model? Yes, so there's another comment, a set of hypothesis maps. Yes, so a model typically consists of a whole set or space of hypothesis maps. For example, the set of all linear maps. And now we attach such a model to each node. So this one has this model, and then we have at this node, we have another model. And this might be a different set of maps. Might be look like this, and here this function. So this might be the model at node 1. So we have a separate model, a local model for each node. And how do we store a model in machine learning? In Python, well, for example, using a linear regression class. So this linear regression object represents a whole space of maps, of linear maps. And we can attach it to each node, or we can attach different such models. So at one node, we can use linear regression. At another node, we can use a decision tree, a scikit-learn decision tree class. So we can have a separate local model for each node. So what do we then do with the models? Yeah, so and also it can be non-parametric models. So we can have parametric models at some nodes, and at other nodes we can have non-parametric models in general. Yeah, maybe the main idea of the course is then to show you a method in next week's lectures, a federated learning method that can handle an arbitrary collection of models, local models. So the local models can be anything at each node and very much different for different nodes. Okay, so let's assume we have now such an empirical graph. So again, the empirical graph, each node of the empirical graph carries a local data set and carries a model. So these two things are attached to each node. What do we then do in machine learning? What do we do with models and data? Fitting, exactly, or training. So we fit the models to data. How should we do this? How should we take the network structure into account here? I mean, the naive approach, the basic approach would be ignore the network structure completely and just train for each local data set, train a model. So this is rather naive. But it might be actually the best thing. So if these local data sets are very big, so if the local data set contains, for example, 1,000 data points, let's say this data set here contains 1,000 data points, and each data point, so 1,000 data points here, this data set, and each data point is characterized by 2 features, and we fit the linear regression model, then there's no need to pool anything or to use a network structure. We fit this model on this data set because the ratio D to M here is much, much smaller than 1. So we are good to go. There's no need to do anything. However, in practice, we use very high dimensional models like deep neural networks, and the local data sets might not be that big. So what we want to do is we want to somehow pool the data together to get larger training sets to boost the number of data points. Okay, so training separately, if possible, is nice because we train a model tailored to each local data set. So we want to maybe also solve different learning tasks. So we want to predict the weather for cycling in Tampere and predict the weather for ice skating in Turku. So these are different learning tasks. So we might want to use different models. It's good if the data sets are large enough. However, if they are not large enough, then what we will do with 2 powerful models like this ice skating prediction model might be very powerful, and we overfit. So that's the drawback. The other option would be pool together all data sets and train a model, one single global model. So this is done also in some federated learning algorithms like federated averaging. Trains a single global model based on all data sets, and this works well. So we have no overfitting because we have typically a large amount of data, but it might have low accuracy if the distribution of this data is different. So this is called non-IID data. So when the data sets itself, each local data set can be modeled as being drawn from a probability distribution, but the probability distribution might be a different one for node 1 than for node 2. So we might have different probability distributions. So they might be not equal. And therefore, we might want to look at an in-between setting where we cluster some of the data points if their distribution is somewhat similar, but do not pool together data sets whose distribution is very different. So that's the idea behind clustered federated learning, where we want to learn the clusters of local data sets that are statistically similar. So behind this approach is a clustering assumption. The assumption that each dot here represents an FMI station, and an FMI station generates local data sets. And these FMI stations might form clusters. And within each cluster, the local data sets share a same common underlying probability distribution. So there's one for cluster 1. This is the cluster 1 distribution. And then there's another one for cluster 2. And all the data points in all the local data sets in cluster 2, they are drawn from the same probability distribution. So it seems natural to pool together the data sets in the same cluster. What's the problem with this cluster-wise training? So if we would know the cluster structure, we just pool together the data sets that are in the same cluster and train a single model for each. So we train a model for cluster 1, or we learn a hypothesis for cluster 1, and we learn another hypothesis for cluster 2. And this hypothesis we share with all the nodes in cluster 1. And this hypothesis we share with all the nodes in cluster 2. So the problem with this cluster-wise training is that we typically do not know the clusters. We only know it's easier to find out this pairwise similarities. So we rather only assume that we know the empirical graph structure, but we do not know the cluster structure. And here's the idea how to find out the clusters just from the edges in an empirical graph. The idea is to say, instead of pooling the data sets in the same cluster, what we can do in the training process, we can enforce the local model parameters to be constant for each node in the same cluster. This is essentially equivalent. So we minimize the loss functions over all nodes in the cluster. And instead of putting them together, we require as a side constraint that all the local weight vectors are constant. So this is equivalent to pooling, to forcing the local data sets to be pooled together. And this enforcing constant local model parameters can be done by penalizing the variation of these model parameters. So the variation is essentially the difference, or some quantitative measure of the difference of the weight vectors of the local model parameters at connected nodes. And we also have here typically an edge weight. So for example, we could use the norm of this difference multiplied by the edge weight to measure the variation. So this might be a measure of variation across this edge. So requiring a small variation essentially forces the local model parameters over well-connected nodes to be identical. So this is the idea of total variation minimization, which I will talk about in Wednesday's lecture, to sum up this variation term and over all edges in the graph, in the empirical graph, and use this term. This is called total variation. Use this term as a regularizer for the training of the local models. And it turns out that adding this term as regularizer effectively forces the learned local model parameters to be constant over a well-connected subset of nodes in the empirical graph. So what this total variation minimization does, it essentially pools the local data sets in the same cluster, which is exactly what we want. But it does the pooling based on the network structure. It does not use any oracle knowledge or unavailable knowledge about cluster identities. It tries to find the clusters in the empirical graph simultaneously while training the local model parameters on the local data sets. So it couples the training on the local data set with the variation between connected nodes. And this is then the main topic of next lecture on Wednesday on total variation minimization. Okay, to wrap up, we have introduced the concept of an empirical graph to represent local data sets and local models in federated learning applications. In particular, the nodes of the empirical graph carry these local data sets and local models. The undirected and weighted edges represent similarities between local data sets, and the extent, so the weight represents the extent or the amount of the similarity between the local data sets. However, there are different sources of similarity measures, and ultimately it's a design choice. So the empirical graph is a design choice that must balance between the computational complexity, which means we want to have as few edges as possible, because this means fewer computation, fewer communication over the graph. On the other hand, we want to have sufficiently many edges such that this regularization method is able to capture the clusters. So we want to have sufficiently many edges between local data sets that form a cluster. Okay, that's all for today. Are there any questions? Okay, if not, please remember that now the quiz for today's lecture is now open, the My Courses quiz. And yeah, do not hesitate to ask any upcoming questions on Slack or by email, by course email. Yeah, here's one question. What are the cluster identities? By cluster identities, I mean the set of nodes that form a cluster. So the set, this is a modeling assumption, of course. This is a modeling assumption. And the modeling assumption is that for a certain subset of nodes, the data sets are obtained by IID realization drawn from some probability distribution. So this is a modeling assumption. And yeah, what we want to do then in the following lectures is to develop methods that find out which local data sets could potentially be realizations from the same probability distribution. Okay. Yeah, thanks a lot, everybody. Then have a nice evening. Bye.